Today, my guest is Yonah Weiss. Yonah is a cost segregation study expert with Madison Specs. They've done over 14,000 cost segregation studies in the past 13 years, covering all 50 states, and that's resulted in over $3 billion in tax savings. So today we're going to speak with him about cost segregation. But first, a quick reminder, if you like the show, CREPN Radio, please let us know. You can like, share, and subscribe, and you can always leave a comment. We love to hear from our listeners. Also, if you'd like to see how handsome our guests are, be sure to check out our YouTube channel. That's at Commercial Real Estate Pro Network. With that, I want to welcome my guest. Yonah, welcome to CREPN Radio.
Thank you very much. Darren, it's a pleasure to be on the show today with you.
I'm looking forward to talking with you. And before we get started here, if you could take a minute and share with the listeners and myself a little bit about your background.
Sure. My background is actually in education. I was a teacher for many years. I actually spent over a decade studying in post-collegiate study. And I just love to learn. And when I have a desire to learn, I love to teach. And that kind of goes to the fact I have 6 children as well. So education is part of my daily, activities with them. But I got really involved in real estate about 4 years ago as a broker, and then just want to learn everything there was about the business in terms of, I went into commercial mortgages and just, my thirst for education took me to invest as well in some single family fix and flips, and now getting involved slowly in multifamily investing as well. But I just love to learn. And that's kind of what brought me to Cost Segregation. The firm that I work with, Madison, has a slew of services, but Cost Segregation happens to be one of their biggest. And just the opportunity that I can come on shows like yours and reach out to a broader audience to talk about something that is so amazing, so impactful for investors, yet at the same time is like an anomaly. People don't really know what it is, and not enough people really understand it and take advantage of it. So kind of using that opportunity in platforms like yours. So I appreciate you for having me. And I guess that's what we're going to talk about, depreciation today a lot, but it always starts with appreciation. So thank you.
Right. No, I appreciate that. More appreciation. The couple things you touched on there, I think are going to be perfect for this, is that, the majority of the listeners here are investors or recognize that real estate is the vehicle that they want to invest in to create a secure future for their family. And also, I think just learning. I think that's probably the biggest benefit of all these conversations is the opportunity to learn what others have done or how to do what they've done. And so I appreciate, again, more appreciation or what you have to offer today. So to get started here, for the uninitiated, could you just describe what is cost segregation?
Sure. And I'll try to make it as brief as possible because it is a very, deep and complex subject. But it has to do with depreciation, which is a tax write-off for investors, for property owners. And it's just a way of breaking down the property into faster depreciation lives than the normal straight line, which goes over 27.5 years or 39 years. So instead of taking a small deduction every single year for 39 years or for 27 years, the IRS actually allows you to reclassify or segregate out the costs of everything in the property to these faster depreciation lives, thereby resulting in greater depreciation deductions, greater tax deductions in the early years of ownership, greater cash flow, et cetera. So in a nutshell, that's what it is.
Got it. So you mentioned the depreciation. Would it be useful just to do a comparison quick so that people
Sure.
fully understand if they don't do this, what it looks like, as opposed to if they do this? And again, I think the key from what I heard you say and kind of what I understand about cost segregation is the opportunity to accelerate the depreciation of the building.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. So sure, let's take an example. what every real estate investor has is depreciation, which again is a tax deduction, and people take what's called, do it in straight line depreciation, which means, like I mentioned, a small amount every single year. So let's take an example of a building that you purchased for $1 million, okay? A commercial property, $1 million. If you divide that by 27.5 years, first of all, we subtract a small amount for land. Land does not depreciate. And then whatever's left over, let's say $800,000, you divide that by 27.5, you're going to wind up with about $30,000 every single year for the next 27 years as a tax deduction, which means if you're making $100,000 from the property on your income, right off the bat, you take off 30,000, you're only going to be taxed on that 70,000. That's straight line depreciation. That's what everyone does. And that's one of the benefits, incredible benefits of real estate investing, is the tax deductions. Cost segregation allows you to front load a certain percentage, and maybe we'll talk about a little later what the percentages are, what are the things that are reclassified. But just for the example, for the number's sake, you may be able to actually double or triple that amount of depreciation in the first 5 or 6 years. So which means instead of $30,000 deduction, in our case, an example, you could potentially have $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 over those first 5 or 6 years as a write-off, which means you're going to be taxed only on the remainder, that $30,000 that remains. So we're looking at a real cash, a net cash value of doing this, not just a simple tax write-off, but it actually results in you keeping more of your own money in your pocket, right? It's not about, some people like to tell me, it's not about what you earn, it's about how much you keep. But it's more about not how much you keep, it's about your money. It's not like people think the IRS, oh yeah, I have to pay taxes. You don't have to pay taxes that the IRS says you don't have to pay, right?
Right.
If they say, here's a way for you to pay less taxes, it doesn't mean, well, I owe it to them. No, it's your money, right? You made the money. Here's a way for you to keep it.
Right. I guess one of the thoughts that comes to mind, and maybe this would be even helpful for listeners that aren't familiar with this, why is it allowed? Why is cost segregation allowed, or what's the reasoning behind doing it?
So the real reason for really, I guess, for any tax benefit, any tax deduction, no one really knows, but I would assume that the IRS, that the government has and wants to give incentives for real estate investors because they are contributing to the economy by producing, more housing, making more jobs, etc. So real estate investors have in general more tax deductions. One person wanted to, gave me a theory that it's really only because 80% of Congress are real estate investors, and that's why they pass all these laws that have, for real estate benefits. That may very well be true. I don't know if that's, going to pass legislation because of that. But, when you look at a property, I think it comes from just logic, right? When we talked about the straight line depreciation, that's still going to apply to the building, to the main structure of a building, okay? And everything goes down in value with time, and that's what depreciation means, right? Your property is going down in value. So the IRS gives you a tax write-off saying, now it's lost value, I'm going to give you a paper write-off based on that loss. So it makes sense that there are things in the property, in the building, like furniture, appliances, fixtures, looking behind you, like the ceiling fan, the curtains, the window frames, right? The shelves, the fixtures over there, everything, all of that stuff actually depreciates at a faster life. And it's not just arbitrary, it really does. Every 5 years or so, you may have to replace, the carpeting, you may have to replace the HVAC, you may have to replace certain things. It actually does go down that, whereas the main structure, that's still going to be there. What is really fascinating, to me at least, about cost segregation, about depreciation in general, is it doesn't even have to do with the property itself. It has to do with the owner of the property. What I mean to say is that when you buy a property, depreciation of that property starts over from day one, the day that you buy it, okay, the day you place it in service, which means that even if it's a 100-year-old building, even if the previous owner had carpeting in there for 20 years and never replaced it, when you buy it, right? Today in 2019, you get to depreciate the full value of that based on your purchase price for 27 years. So the guy may have, bought it for $100,000 20 years ago. You're buying it for $2 million in 2019. You're depreciating the full amount of that building and everything in it for 27 years based on that value.
No, I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think that, so many times, I think the first reference I ever had to depreciation was the reference when I was, maybe 16 and talking about buying a car with my dad and talking about buying a new car. And as soon as you drive it over the curb, it depreciates, and that loss of value was just kind of what I associated that with. But I think the other thing I wanted to, I think you bring up 2 points there. One is that as a physical structure ages, its systems, whether it be the heating, roof, plumbing, carpet, whatever it might be, they do tend to wear out. I mean, they have a life expectancy, and at the end of that, you're going to have to replace them. Correct. And so essentially, if I recognize what you're saying and kind of apply it to what I know about buildings and stuff, essentially the whole notion of depreciation is that you're going to have to replace it. And therefore this schedule is some sort of a means of tying that element to a timetable and giving you the benefit of recognizing you're going to have to replace it at a point. Is that essentially it right there? And then
I'll just let you ask the next question, but just in theory, because as we'll see, there are applications of it that show that it is really just theoretical in many senses.
Sure. No, and I would guess too, depending on how long you're going to hold the building, would maybe factor into that a little bit. But again, the other point I think that I think is definitely worth reiterating is the point you made about, even if it's an old building, if it's new to you, the clock starts at zero.
That's correct.
So you get to start even if it's an older building.
Correct.
So let me ask you this. So what, I don't know if it's better to ask, how do you do a cost segregation study, or who can do a cost segregation study?
Right. So I'll answer both, because it's really how it goes. The process in doing cost segregations, the IRS has an entire section of the tax code called the Cost Segregation Audit Techniques Guide, which is essentially a 400 odd page guide to how to properly do a cost segregation study, which requires someone to perform it, or an entity, a group to perform it, which is why there are firms like ours, Madison Specs, who specialize in this, that need to have experience not only in the tax code, but engineering and construction experience in doing that. So, for example, we have 13 full-time engineers on staff who have decades, of combined experience in performing these studies. So they know exactly what to look for. That's, who's to do it. How it's actually done is, obviously taking those rules, applying it means they have to go to the property and do a full survey of the property, meaning checking out, taking pictures, taking, all the data from what's there, square footage of everything, and compiling that into a full-blown report, which winds up being 80, 90, 100 pages long, detailing all of the assets that are in the building, outside the building. What are their depreciation lives? We had mentioned 27.5 or 39 for commercial buildings. That's the structure. But there are other lives, that 5-year depreciation life to all personal property or fixtures, things like that, tangible assets in the building. 15-year life to all things that are land improvements. So that's, including asphalt, pavement, landscaping, fencing, signage, anything that's outside of the building, outside of a property, that actually depreciates at a 15-year life schedule. And, some smaller things, 7-year, 10-year. There are other, a few other items that depreciate over those lives, but the main two are 5 and 15. So once they go and compile and say, hey, there's 2,700 square feet of carpeting in this property, making the calculations, when it was placed in service, what is the industry standard cost per square foot of something like that, applying that and taking that cost, segregating it out, if you will. I really hate the name, but you kind of have to use it just so you don't lose sight of the fact that it's called cost segregation for whatever reason, right? But they're segregating, they're taking out the cost, the value of that carpeting, for example, and depreciating that over a 5-year period.
Got it. Is there a time when someone should engage in a cost segregation study? I mean, if I own a building right now, I've already missed the opportunity, or is it something I need to do when I buy it new?
Yeah, there's really any time is the right time, but it's really subjective to when you need those tax deductions. Most people will get it done in the first year of ownership. So immediately after buying a property, they just want to get it out of the way so it's ready for their next year's tax returns. However, as you mentioned, if you already purchased a property in a previous tax year, you did not miss out. You can actually get retroactively, you can do a cost segregation study, all the way back, as far as 30 years, there's still any depreciation, but realistically speaking, usually there's benefit, doing it back 5-6 years retroactively, there's still potentially benefit there. And that doesn't, involve any opening of amending of tax returns. It's not, a very daunting process in doing that. It's a simple, as much as filling out a form that the IRS allows you to change the method of depreciation.
Got it.
Yeah.
Let me ask you on the who can benefit from a cost segregation study. Are there any requirements or issues that before entering into it, or hurdles that I have to cross in order to benefit from a cost segregation study?
There aren't. I mean, the only real hurdle, if you will, is that you have to be taxable, right? So like I mentioned before, it's kind of relative to if you need those tax deductions, but someone who's, a nonprofit entity or something, or if it's your personal residence, you don't get cost segregation, you don't get depreciation on your personal residence. That's the only, type of property. It doesn't, we're talking about business properties, investment properties. So anyone that's taxable, that's really where they're going to benefit from it.
Okay. And are there any potential problems? Is there any? I'm just trying to think of. You've listed
Sure.
all the benefits of doing it. I'm
Right.
just kind of trying to think of what would be some potential problems from doing a cost segregation study.
Right. So there are a couple, things that just jump out, right? Number one, doing a cost segregation study does not raise any red flags with the IRS if it's done properly, meaning just having a cost segregation study done, having all that depreciation does not, raise any red flags unless you're, the president or something like that. And you have, huge amount of tax deductions that may raise flags with, your enemies, but it doesn't raise red flags with the IRS because they created the rules, they enforce the rules. However, one thing that, if you don't do it properly, meaning if you just want to do kind of a rule of thumb or, throw a dart at the wall and say, yeah, hey, I think about, 20% of this building should be reallocated to a 5-year life, and you don't have the documentation to back that up, that's where you're going to get in problems, right? Doing it without, the proper engineering study. That's the first thing. The second thing is not necessarily a problem, but an issue that may arise for some people, which is something that when you sell a property, there is a tax called depreciation recapture tax, okay, which is a really scary thing, right? The IRS, gives you all these benefits when you own the property, but then when you go to sell it, they come and hit you with all these taxes, capital gains tax, right? Depreciation recapture tax, et cetera, even sales tax in some states, which is crazy. But the depreciation recapture can be deferred along with capital gains tax if you do a 1031 exchange. So that, half the people that are selling properties are doing it through a 1031 exchange. So that really, I'd say wipes that off for them as well, defers taxes further on. The other people who are not doing 1031 exchange, don't misunderstand that you have to pay back all the depreciation that you took. No, it just means that you are now taxed on the sale, on the amount of depreciation you took, which you benefited from the entire life of ownership, which means you had the cash flow, you had the time value of money, which is, you know, using that, plus you have the arbitrage, the difference in taxes, which usually the depreciation recapture tax is usually 25%, which is usually anyways going to be less than one's or many people's income tax rate. So you're anyways benefiting on all three levels on the sale. But another thing that is seldom, you know, a little not so famous, but a lot of tax firms use this strategy, which is called the partial asset disposition, which means that when you sell a property, it has less value in it than when you bought it. So let's take the carpeting, right? Let's say you bought the carpeting and you allocated a cost for that for $100,000 of the carpeting in a commercial building. You're depreciating that 5 years. 5 years later, you sell the building. Guess what? You fully depreciated that carpeting, and there's really very little value to it. So instead of having to pay the depreciation recapture tax on that $100,000 that you just depreciated, which would be $25,000, you can actually allocate a very small amount to that with this partial asset disposition, and therefore pay, you know, virtually nothing on the depreciation recapture tax.
So just
I know that
to,
was a lot.
walk, you bring up an interesting point. So I've done a cost segregation study, get a crazy offer to sell. And so I've got some carpeting, and like the example you listed, its replacement value is 100,000. I've depreciated it a few years. So now let's say that there's only $60,000 left of value per the depreciation schedule. Does that mean that the depreciation, depreciation recapture tax would be based on the 40 that I've depreciated? Is that what I'm understanding?
Correct. You have to actually actively claim that. Okay. And there's a form that goes along that you can actually use this partial asset disposition to show the IRS that I bought this, I placed it in service, 3-4 years ago, and now I'm selling it. And there's, X value to it, $40,000 left to it. And that allows you to then make the calculation, or your accountant to make that calculation based on that. So it's not just a simple, something that it's just a given. You actually have to actively do that.
Gotcha. I'm just trying to think, who would it benefit more to do a cost segregation study? Would it benefit somebody that's a buy and hold investor, or would it be something that somebody that's a value add, kind of a syndicator that's kind of a get in, do some renovations in a couple of years and raise the rents and increase the value, kind of a play? Is there a case to be made that one may be better served for cost segregation study?
I think both. And in my experience, and like you mentioned at the beginning, our firm, we've done over 14,000 studies across the US. And we have, across the board, all types of people, investors that are doing this. So, from large institutional REITs, business owners, value add, like you mentioned, long-term holds. Anyone who is actively a real estate investor will really benefit from this. I would say that someone who is just buying one property and that's it, and they have, they're happy with their tax situation, they don't have the extra need for extra deductions, then it may not make sense for them. They may be better off strategically spreading out their depreciation, spreading out their tax liability, so it's kind of more even, over the life of ownership, because they're holding it forever, basically. But anyone who's constantly, buying, let's say they're buying a new property every year or every 2 years or more than that, several times a year, then really what they care about more than anything is cash flow, right? If you have the cash flow, you can buy more properties. So if you're thinking about buying more than one property, your main concern right now is more cash flow. And so if you can have more money that you're making, keeping that in your pocket, reinvesting that, yourself, you're doing much better with that money than Uncle Sam was doing with that money, right? So you put it to use instead of, letting them take your money and put it to use, who knows with what.
Right. A thought occurred to me, and tell me if this makes sense. To do a cost segregation study, you essentially, you guys are going in and documenting all of the different elements that make up the building. Is that right? For the on the
Correct.
study, the report that one's going to end up with is going to document, uh, paint and light switch and you know everything that
Everything.
that is in the building, right?
Correct.
So would that not even just be like a benefit, just to be able to kind of a baseline document that's categorically puts a time and date for the condition of the building, and then from then you can, if you are replacing or repairing certain things, you can easily go in and circle that and subtract out what was, and then put in the new. Is that
Yeah, yeah. Essentially, what you're saying is using that as kind of like a, I guess,
kind of a ledger of
yeah,
sorts of?
exactly, a ledger to even, what, like you said, when you're going to replace something, you can actually go and write off the value of what you replaced because now you actually know what the value was for that. So even from a tax perspective, not just the ledger, just for good measure, for organizational purposes, but actually even for tax purposes. If you know now that the carpet is actually, you didn't build the property, right? You just bought it. You wouldn't know that the carpet was worth $100,000 or 127,000, whatever it is, unless you had an engineer determine that. Now that you did and you replaced the carpet, you can now go write off that value when you replace that.
Let's take this one more step. So let's say we
Mm-hmm.
have a new to me building.
Right?
Your firm comes in and does a cost segregation study, and in year two, I've got to replace my carpet. Can you take me through just the what we'd be looking at? And let's just say, for example, that you guys have valued the carpet at 100,000, and so I'm assuming, is carpet a 5-year
Yes.
depreciation? Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so essentially, I've got 20,000 worth of depreciation scheduled for the next 5 years. If just simple math, is that
Correct. Yes.
okay? So year two, I just took 20,000, but now I'm going to replace the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what happens to that 80,000 that I haven't taken?
Excellent question. So that's actually now a tax write-off, right? You can actually write that amount off because you're now disposing of it. Um, or potentially the entire amount, but likely a smaller amount of what's left of it. Not necessarily the entire amount, unless you put in a brand new carpet. So there's actually kind of a dichotomy here, meaning when you buy the property and doing cost segregation, the IRS allows you to take the depreciation as if it was new, right? Because
Right.
it really is new. However, when you go and dispose of it, right, something that's disposed of doesn't really have so much value anymore, right? So you are allowed to write it off, but you're not allowed to write off the entire amount once you dispose of it because now it's once you've taken it out, it's really not worth as much as it was when it was in there, if that makes sense.
Sure.
So yeah, you are allowed to take them out, but only once you've kind of done that, like I mentioned, with the allocation from the engineer that you know what that value is. Otherwise, you'd kind of just, you'd still be depreciating that $100,000 on your basis, right, on the property for the next 27 and a half years, or at least for the next 5 years if you did the cost segregation, for the next, I guess, 2 or 3 years in our case. Um, so what that's really why it's important to use that as a write-off, because otherwise you're just going to be left with that amount on your basis, depreciating, and not taking advantage of actually depreciating the new carpet as well.
Got it. So when I take out the what's remaining life of the original carpet, and I put in a new carpet, instead of it costing me 100, it cost me 120. So does the 120 then replace that original value for the carpet, and now that's on its own new 5-year
Correct.
schedule?
Yes, that's exactly right.
Okay. So that so um I guess my next thought is, how does this relate then on your on the on the valuation of the property, because I know like on your tax schedule you've got the you have your basis that you
Hmm.
start with, and each year your depreciated value lowers that basis, right?
Correct.
So when you put in something new, does that essentially then prop up that basis by the cost of the, or I guess it'd be the difference, because if you're writing off
Hmm.
the the old and you're putting in the new, while your basis, if you didn't replace it, would go down the what you took out. Now you've put in
Right.
the new, so the difference would be kind of a net increase in value, I think. Is that?
Yeah, well, it's really two different lines, but yeah, essentially what it ends up being is a net increase. Correct. Yeah, but you would add it as a separate, an additional line to depreciate that over the 5 years, which is really what the conservation does in general. Is it creates a new depreciation schedule instead of just that straight line schedule, 27 and a half years. You have a 15-year schedule and a 5-year schedule as well, and it breaks it down, much more clearly so that you can get all that depreciation earlier.
Got it. Got it. So is there a recent example of a cost segregation study that you've done that you could cite as far as kind of a size of a property and the benefit to the owner?
Sure. I mean, we like I mentioned, we've done so many, and even in 2018 alone, we did over 2,000 studies. So,
Oh,
any type of property you take, but I guess just for our purposes here, let's take multifamily since that happens to be a very popular um, asset class. We did a 188 unit multifamily property out in Texas, El Paso. It was over $9 million purchase price. So with a straight line depreciation, they would have had about, after the land allocation, they would have had about $280,000 of depreciation every year, which is great. That's huge, right? You have $280,000 write-off, sounds like a huge number. But when you have a $750,000 net operating income, right, you're still going to be liable on over about $500,000 in taxes. Okay, which are taxed on $500,000, which means you're going to be paying a few $100,000 in taxes. What we did over here, we were able to allocate about 21% of that basis, of that building value, to 5-year property, which means stuff like furniture, fixtures, appliances, special purpose lighting, special purpose electric, plumbing, things like that. Even little things like mirrors, carpeting. We don't even think about it. A mailbox. All that stuff has a value and depreciates faster. So 21%. So we're talking about over $2 million, or close to $2 million as a write-off, an extra write-off, meaning on top of the $280,000 straight line depreciation, an extra write-off of about $2 million over this first 5 years. And then the 15-year property, also in that property, I think was like 9 or 10%, which is pretty average. I'd say, overall 30% on a large garden-style multifamily property is, around 30% is going to be reallocated. It could be a little more, it could be a little less. It does depend on a lot of factors. So yeah, we're looking at over $2.5 million of extra depreciation over those first 5 years, which means he basically was not paying taxes. He and his investors not paying taxes for the first 5 years.
nope, don't know anybody that gets upset about that. Seems like a pretty good idea. Can you speak to the cost? What should somebody expect this to cost to do a study?
It should cost, there are obviously a number of firms out there that do this. I can only speak to our firm, but it really does depend more than anything else on the size and type of property, because our price is based on the scope of work involved, and not at all has to do with the percentage of your tax benefits. So you may have a 100-unit multifamily building, right, that you bought for $10 million. It may cost $5,000 to $6,000 for the price, which is very inexpensive. You think about the $2 million of tax benefit, extra depreciation you're getting, it's almost nothing. However, if you bought let's say a very cheap 100-unit building out in who knows, in Wyoming or whatever for $1 million, right? The price would be the same. Meaning it's, even if your tax benefit, on that would be only about, $200,000, but the fee would be the same. Again, not based on any percentage, because the IRS obviously looks down on that. You're determining how much tax savings they can get, so you can take a piece of it. Doesn't
Right. No, it makes sense. No, and if you're out there doing physical inspection, it makes sense that it would be more kind of geared to the size of the property and kind of more like a construction cost as opposed to a percent of the value kind of thing.
correct.
Makes sense. Yonah, I want to shift gears if we could here.
Sure.
Before we started recording, I explained to you, by day I'm an insurance broker, and a lot of what we do is risk management.
Right.
And we typically look at, there's about 3 different strategies that are kind of the primary means we use. And 1 is avoid the risk, 2 is to minimize the risk, and then 3rd is transfer the risk, which is essentially what an insurance policy is.
Okay.
And so I've been asking my guests if they could identify what they see is the biggest risk. And I'm not necessarily looking for an insurance related question, but if you could take a look at real estate investing and maybe how cost segregation, or I don't know how you want to view it, but just on the bigger picture of risk, if you could identify what you see is the biggest risk.
Okay. So I'll actually take this in a little bit of a different direction than maybe some of your other guests have, and maybe you might be expecting, but kind of going along with my, just personal look on this. And it's really a risk for anything, not necessarily specific to real estate, but more over the top applies to real estate, I would think, more than anything in my experience. And that risk is actually arrogance. Okay, so what I mean by that is, when you are thinking that you're going about and you're making, $1 million, you're making $10 million, and it's all you, right? You did it all. There is a certain, when you start thinking like that, you get into a very dangerous situation. Not just with yourself personally, with the people around you. And everyone knows that real estate investing is really a team sport. And there are so many people that are involved. So when you start to think just about yourself and think about how, you did it all by yourself and how great I am, and obviously that's important. I'm not talking about, low self-esteem here, but real humility means that I'm willing to cooperate. I'm willing to learn from everyone around me. I realize that I can't do this on my own. I realize that, whatever talents I have, are really God-given gifts, and I have to be grateful for that and recognize that and use them. But at the same time, don't think that, I'm the best thing in the world, because that's the biggest risk. As soon as you start thinking that, and history proves itself over and over and over again, you're bound to fail, and you're bound to, lose whatever you have built, lose whatever friends you've made, etc. And it's just an easy way to lose friends in general. So that's what I think the biggest risk is.
Oh, I love it. Definitely well said, and a lesson that applies throughout life. So thank you for that. Yonah, where can the listeners go if they would like to learn more or connect with you?
The best place to connect with me, actually, LinkedIn. I'm very active there, posting content all the time, very actively engaged, especially in commercial real estate. Bigger Pockets, another great place to do it. Our website, madisonspecs.com, is undergoing, as we speak, a huge remakeover, or makeover, not remakeover. Well, I guess it's a remakeover, but it's, so you can check that out, or check back in a few months. And then, reach out to me if you want to get a free estimate, a feasibility analysis, where we will actually look at your property and, just from a cost perspective, show you what your benefits would be, what your tax benefits would be by doing a full cost segregation study. It's free, costs nothing. It's our service to you. You can reach out to me by email, phone number. You can, I guess, put that in the show notes over there. And yeah, we're good to go.
All right. Well, we will include all of that in the show notes. So I encourage the listeners to check that out. Yonah, I want to say thanks for taking the time. I've enjoyed talking with you and learned a lot, and hope we can do it again soon.
Oh, likewise. Thank you very much, Darren. It was a pleasure.
All right. For our listeners, if you like this episode, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Remember, the more you know, the more you grow. That's all we've got this week. Until next time, thanks for listening to Commercial Real Estate Pro Network's CREPN Radio.